Picture this, 1.5 million balloons, all set to launch into the sky. It's supposed to be this, awe-inspiring event, a symbol of hope and all that good stuff. But then it all goes wrong, terribly wrong. And that's kind of what happened back in 1986 at the Cleveland Balloon Fest, an event that was meant to, well, give Cleveland a boost, but ended up leaving behind a whole lot of heartache and legal battles.
It really is a story about a specific time and place, the 1980s, a time of these massive events, and maybe a time when people didn't really think about the environment as much as they do now. I mean, the idea that millions of balloons would just disappear, up into the air and poof, gone. Well, it wasn't something people were thinking about back then.
It's like everyone had this blind spot, right? That we could just launch these colorful balloons up and they just vanish. But like we know, things are way more complicated.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's what makes the Balloon Fest story so interesting. To understand what happened, we need to rewind a bit and see how this whole thing came together. We've got Cleveland, a city trying to shake off this mistake on a lake image. They're pinning all their hopes on this one big event.
And then you have the United Way. They're this well-respected charity. They want to do something big for their annual fundraiser. So they get in touch with Treb Heining, this famous balloon artist. The guy behind all those crazy balloon arches you see at parades and stuff.
So Heining, along with this event planner named Tom Hollowak, they had this huge job ahead of them. They had to design and build this massive balloon bin right in downtown Cleveland. It was this 3-story tall structure made of scaffolding, and it was supposed to hold 2 million balloons. Just imagine that.
Yeah, can you picture that? Like this giant net filled with balloons just waiting to be released. They had thousands of volunteers inflating all those balloons. They had trucks full of helium coming in all the time. And the whole city was holding its breath, hoping that this event would finally put them on the map for something good.
The energy was amazing. People were genuinely excited. They wanted to be a part of something big, something special. But then, the night before the launch, a storm hit Cleveland. Ripped through the balloon bin, tore up the tarps and netting they had protecting the balloons.
Talk about a bad omen, right? Nature was sending them a message. Well, they managed to fix everything, but it was definitely a wake-up call. Even the best laid plans can go wrong.
Absolutely. And that brings up a really important question. Was there too much pressure to just ignore the warnings? I mean, did Cleveland want to change its image so badly that they overlooked the risks?
Yeah, I mean, this event wasn't just about balloons, right? It was about this city yearning for a fresh start. So even though there was another bad weather report, saying a storm was coming, they decided to go ahead with the launch. 15 minutes ahead of schedule, actually.
So picture this. They release 1.5 million balloons. Not quite the 2 million they wanted, but still a record, right? And they're rising into the sky, but then the wind picks up and the clouds roll in. It was beautiful for a minute, but then nature took over.
And those balloons, instead of floating away like they were supposed to, they get pushed back down by the wind and rain. What was supposed to be this amazing sight turned into, total chaos. Balloons everywhere, covering the entire city.
Reporters at the time, they said it was like driving through streets flooded with balloons, people crashing their cars because they couldn't see. It's almost like something out of a weird dream.
And yeah, the mess on land was bad, but what happened on Lake Erie was much, much worse.
So while all this was happening in Cleveland, with the balloons and all that chaos out on Lake Erie, there was this whole other situation going on. The Coast Guard was out searching for these 2 fishermen who had gone missing during the storm the night before.
It's kind of crazy to think about, right?
Yeah.
While the city's celebrating, these 2 guys are out there on the lake fighting for their lives. And as the balloons started falling, it made the search and rescue even harder.
Yeah, you had all these balloons floating on the lake, and it made it almost impossible for the Coast Guard to see anything, They couldn't find the fishermen, they couldn't even see their boat.
I can't even imagine how frustrating that must have been. Every second counts in those situations, and those balloons were like this giant obstacle.
Exactly. And it wasn't just that they were blocking the view, they were also giving people false hope,
Wow.
Some of those balloons, when they got wet, they kind of looked like life jackets from a distance. So there were these, false sightings that just slowed everything down even more.
Oh man, that's just awful. The families of those fishermen must have been going through hell, clinging to any bit of hope. And then those balloons just dashed it all away.
It's really sad. And because of all those balloons, the Coast Guard helicopters couldn't even fly. It was too dangerous. So they lost that aerial perspective that could have been so crucial.
It's hard to believe something as simple as balloons could cause so much trouble in a life or death situation.
Yeah, it really shows you how connected everything is. How something that's supposed to be a happy celebration can end up having these terrible unintended consequences.
It took weeks for them to find the bodies of those fishermen, and everyone said it was because of those balloons. And once Balloon Fest was over, the lawsuits started piling up.
The United Way, they got hit with lawsuits from people who got hurt by the balloons, people who had property damage, and then, of course, the families of those two fishermen.
Yeah. It's a reminder that even when you have good intentions, things can still go wrong. It makes you wonder if having that event was even worth it, knowing all the risks.
For sure. Those lawsuits were settled out of court, but Cleveland's image and the United Way's reputation, they took a big hit. It's a lesson we can all learn from. Think about all the possible outcomes, especially when you're planning something that big.
And the crazy thing is, even with all that happened, Cleveland still got a Guinness World Record for the largest ever mass balloon release. Talk about a bittersweet victory.
Right. It's like they wanted to bring hope and renewal to the city, but it ended up highlighting all their problems. It's almost like, a metaphor for Cleveland's struggles, this uphill battle they've been fighting for so long.
It makes you think, knowing how it all turned out, was Balloon Fest really worth it? Was that short moment of excitement worth all the pain and damage it caused?
That's a tough question, and there's no easy answer. It really makes you think about ambition, the desire for these big spectacles, and how sometimes our actions can have these crazy consequences we never see coming.
So let's switch gears for a bit. Okay, we're going to go from this massive public event, Balloon Fest, to the story of a man living a double life, a man named Leslie Arnold.
His story is like a deep dive into the human mind. It's about secrets, redemption, and it spans decades and continents. We're going to be talking about identity, guilt, and whether someone can really change who they are.
Leslie's story starts back in 1958 in a pretty normal suburb in Nebraska. He was a talented musician, your average teenager, with a girlfriend named Crystal. But behind that normal facade, his family life was a mess.
His mom, Opal, she had these mental health issues that no one really knew about, and she was a really tough, controlling parent. She was always putting Leslie down, and she didn't like his girlfriend, Crystal, so that just made things worse.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster. You've got this teenage angst mixed with a toxic home life. And on September 27th, 1958, it all blew up.
So Leslie wanted to take Crystal out on a date, but his mom wouldn't let him use the car. They got into this huge fight, and Leslie, in a moment of anger, grabbed his .22 rifle. He just wanted to scare her, into giving in.
I can't even imagine what was going through his head. This kid driven to that point by years of anger and resentment. But it gets even worse. Leslie's dad heard the fighting and ran into the room and tried to stop Leslie. And he ended up getting shot and killed too.
In just a few minutes, Leslie's life was completely changed. He was 16 years old, and now he was a double murderer. He had this horrible secret to carry with him.
And after doing something so terrible, Leslie made a choice that's really hard to understand. Instead of confessing, he decided to hide what he did.
He made up this story about his parents having to go to Wyoming to help his grandparents. That's what he told everyone. And then, get this, he took Crystal to the drive-in like nothing had happened.
That's chilling, right? I mean, he just murdered his parents and then goes on a date. It's like he wasn't even connected to reality.
And for 2 weeks, he kept up this act. He buried his parents' bodies in the backyard and pretended everything was fine. It's like something out of a true crime movie, a mix of lies and desperation.
But the truth always has a way of coming out right. Leslie's grandparents, they didn't believe his story, and they called the police. And when they confronted him, his whole facade crumbled. He confessed to the murders and led them to the graves.
So at 16 years old, Leslie Arnold was convicted of second-degree murder and got a life sentence. It seemed like the right punishment for such a terrible crime.
It's a sad ending to a young life that went so wrong. But that wasn't the end of Leslie's story. It was actually the start of a whole new chapter, one with twists and turns you wouldn't believe. A chapter that makes you question what redemption really means, what identity is, and how strong the human will to survive can be. Okay, so we left off with Leslie in prison, serving a life sentence for killing his parents when he was just a teenager. But, life is full of surprises, and his story definitely takes some unexpected turns.
So Leslie's in Nebraska serving his time, and then you have this Deputy U.S. Marshal Matt Westover, a pretty determined guy. He's looking back at old cases, cold cases, and Leslie's case catches his eye. It had been years, but Westover thought maybe with all the new technology they could find a new lead, finally close the case.
Makes sense. I mean, they've solved so many cold cases lately with DNA and all that.
Exactly. And like fate would have it, this retired investigator suggests they tried DNA genealogy. It was a pretty new thing back then, but it was working really well for these cold cases.
Oh, wow. So what do? Dig up the bodies or something?
Well, no. Westover got a DNA sample from Leslie's younger brother and sent it to this genealogy database. They were hoping to find a match that would lead them to Leslie. It was a long shot, and they had to wait like 2 years.
Wow, that's dedication. It's amazing how these investigators never give up, even after all those years.
It really is. But while Westover is working on the case, on the other side of the world in Australia, Leslie's son, John Vincent Damon Jr., he starts searching for answers too. He knew his dad grew up in a Chicago orphanage, but when he went there to learn more, he hit a wall. There was nothing.
Oh, man, that's got to be unsettling. Like finding out your whole family history might be a lie.
Yeah, it really messed him up. John Jr. kept digging, and he found out something crazy. The orphanage his dad said he grew up in didn't even exist. The birth certificate he had, it was fake. His whole identity was a question mark.
Wow, talk about a bombshell. The past always seems to find a way of catching up to us, doesn't it?
You got that right. So John Jr. really wants to know the truth. So in 2022, he sends his DNA to a genealogy database. He just wanted to find some kind of connection, any clue about his dad's real identity. And that one little act, it set off a chain of events that would finally blow Leslie's secret wide open.
No way.
Yeah.
So what happened? Did he get a match?
He did. Back in Nebraska, Westover gets this notification. It's a DNA match linking John Jr. directly to Leslie Arnold's family.
Get out of here. So all those years, all that mystery, it was solved just like that.
Yep, technology and a lot of hard work paid off, decades of questions, and then suddenly, bam, the truth comes out. It's kind of a bittersweet moment, though.
Why bittersweet? I mean, they finally found him, right?
Yeah, but John Jr. found out about his dad's real identity just a few years after his dad died. He never got to confront him, to ask him questions, to maybe even make peace with it all.
Oh, man, that's rough. I guess sometimes the truth hurts, even when it's what you've been searching for.
Exactly. So while John Jr.'s trying to process all this, Westover flies to Australia to meet him and try to fill in the blanks about Leslie's life, those missing decades.
So what did he find out? What kind of life did Leslie build for himself using that fake name, John Vincent Damon?
Turns out, Leslie married a woman named Jean and became a stepdad to her 4 daughters. People said he was a good guy, worked hard, took care of his family. He was strict, but he loved his kids. Later on, he moved to Los Angeles, started a new family, and just lived a normal life.
It's crazy, but he was living 2 completely separate lives. Like he had this whole other identity. But that dark past, that teenage murderer, it was always there, lurking beneath the surface.
And the wildest part, he never told anyone, not his wives, not his kids, no one. He kept that secret his whole life. Can you imagine the pressure of living like that?
It must have been exhausting, always looking over your shoulder, carrying that guilt around.
That's the big question, isn't it? Did he really change? Was he a different person? I mean, his stepdaughters and his kids, they all said he was a good dad. Even if he wasn't perfect, he was there for them,
It makes you think about good and evil.
Yeah.
It's not always black and white. Maybe people can change, even after doing something terrible.
And maybe that's what we should take away from this story. People are complicated. We're capable of doing awful things, but also amazing things. We can change. We can grow.
So we started off talking about a million balloons and a city trying to find hope. But it ended in disaster. It showed how good intentions can go wrong, how our actions can have these unintended consequences. And then we heard about Leslie, this man who ran from his past, built a new life, and maybe even found some redemption, even though it was hidden.
2 very different stories, right?
Yeah.
But they both make you think about what it means to be human, the desire for something bigger than ourselves, the burden of guilt, the power of hope, and how change is always possible, even when things seem hopeless.
And here's something to think about, before we go. What if Leslie's story happened today? With social media and the internet and everything being out there, could he have gotten away with it? Could he have kept his secret? It's a different world now. The past is never really gone, is it? Anyway, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.